Hey, it's Friday. It's the
Hey.
hotline. Here we are without audio issues, without audio-visual issues this week. Back to normal,
baby.
everybody. We do this hotline every Friday. We're streaming live on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can go to CUIHotline.org and fill out the form and submit a question, or you could call the actual real live phone number and leave your question on there, and we will get to it as soon as we can. We have a ton of stuff queued up from previous streams, from the AB Town Hall, plus whatever people are going to have in chat. So we're back on the grind, doing our thing on the Q&A. Daniel, you're here.
I'm here.
How's it going?
It's going good. It's been a little bit of an interesting memorial, come back from Memorial Day. People trying to get things done at the end of the month and timelines moving for people and getting brought in. I've had probably about 4 or 5 conversations this week that I originally had 2 or 3 years ago to start the domino effect. And now people are still just ready for CMMC. So the pressure is on. I can feel it in the calls that I'm on. Someone jokingly told me, do you wake up every morning trying to make people cry? And I'm like, I don't intend to, but that tends to be the results these days. It's kind of interesting. I mean, one of the conversations I had this week with an organization had gone through a DIBCAC joint surveillance, got certified, 110, beautiful, perfect score. And then about a year or so lapses and they have to self-attest to their new score that went down to a 2. And it's like, when I popped the hood a little bit and I started asking questions, I was like, what happened? And they were like, honestly, we've been reporting the score as it's been dropping day by day up to leadership. And it was the enforcement of organizational adoption of the policies and procedures. It's like we dropped so far because people were not following what they were supposed to be following. And we were reporting and deducting points accordingly. And so anyways, it was very interesting just because, you realize there's a reason and a mechanism for an annual self-attesting after your certification, because there will be slippage and your leadership needs to make sure to continue to hold people accountable. So anyways, it was a really interesting conversation just because I realized, even though you're certified, you get the green check, people still have to pay attention to it very, very closely.
I mean, something about entropy and laws of the universe, right? Things are just going to drift towards disorder. I mean, this is one of the reasons why continuous monitoring is such a massive part of what they talk about in 853 and the RMF. It's one of the main criticisms. I don't think it's well-founded, but point-in-time assessments are only a point in time. And so if you just leave the system alone and don't look at it, and then you come back, it won't be in the same state. So going from 110 to 2 is pretty rough, though. That's a pretty big drop.
Pretty large.
So what was their play? They were reaching out after they got to a 2, or what was the situation?
Well, so they were reaching out about, potentially going to the GovCloud because they were using other solutions. And their leadership, when the time to report their updated score came into play, their leadership in the course of 30 days got everyone right-sized, and they got their score almost back up to a perfect 110. It was basically a sprint to make sure that they could actually self-report a correct score and eliminate the slippage that they had over the trailing 12 months. So yeah, very interesting.
Gotcha.
But it took executive leadership to not want to have to report a lower score to the DoD for any level of action to be taken, even though that drop in score kept getting reported up to that same leadership chain.
Wow.
And so
that's a great recipe for getting a False Claims Act issue.
I know.
It sounds exactly like what happened to Morris, right?
Yeah. So anyways, we hear those stories fairly frequently around these parts, which is sad, but sadly it's the IT people or the compliance people, GRC teams, sysadmins, net admins that have kind of owned responsibility of this kind of stuff. And in reality, it needs to be pushed really far up the chain. I'll say this, and I've said it many times, if you're an IT director, a sysadmin, or a GRC person, do not be the senior official stated when you submit your score. Make sure that you're actually having a true representative of the organization. Because if there is blowback, You do not want your name on that in an incorrect way.
Yeah, what's Ryan Bonner always say? He's like, which one of you is going to wear the orange jumpsuit? That's the one who needs to be the senior company official.
Who has to write the check or wear orange? You know, it's like those are the two things. Bring them to the table because they need to be well informed and they need to commit the company to the score that you're providing. So
yeah, it's a good rule of thumb there. So alrighty, let's see here. Moving on. Okay. Taylor did nothing wrong. Oh wait, sorry. This is my other. This is my Secret Lives of Mormon Wives podcast. Sorry. Hold on. Sorry, let me switch over here. Sorry about that, everybody.
Late night binging, huh, Jacob?
Okay. So we talked to one of the people who was one of the original authors of CMMC all the way back in the day. One of the core people who wrote the thing when the whole thing first started, has been involved with it ever since. And it was so interesting to talk to them because this person was one of the primary authors on the entire framework. And despite that vast amount of knowledge of how the thing works, they are stuck in their current organization due to leadership apathy, organizational debts, scheduling, approvals, budgets. And you and I were talking after we got off the call, and we were like, if you needed any more evidence that this is not just a technical problem, this is the perfect case study where it's like the people who literally wrote the thing, when they get plopped into an organizational context, are not able to just press the button and get done in a month, right? I mean, this is not the first call that we've had with them, and it's a relatively large organization that they're a part of, but it's just not the problem, right? Even if you have perfect knowledge, if you will, perfect knowledge of the model, of the framework, of the requirements, how they work, how they're assessed, 171A, all the intricacies of everything under the surface, it's still not going to be an easy button if your organization isn't buying in. And this sort of gets back to what you were talking about with that call earlier. And I just thought that was a very interesting call to be on, because if you're now trying to do both, where you also don't understand how the model works, how the framework operates, any of the technical implementations, how to migrate, configure, maintain, all those things, and you have organizational issues, it ain't happening in 30 days. It's just not going to be a thing.
I mean, I get the privilege of talking to some of the like really brilliant, incredibly smart people that know CMMC. This person included, obviously, in that conversation. And what shocks me is, like, they feel handcuffed by the organization who hired them to come in and fix the problem. And that's the irony of the whole thing. It's like, you bring me off the street as an expert in this. I'm, telling you this is what we need to do. Option one is you don't trust what I say, so you call, get consultants on the phone. Okay, well then why did you hire me, first off? And then second off, if they say the same thing I say and you actually believe it at that time, you don't give me the budget to execute it. So it's like, there's just such a bizarre tension. And I keep saying it, until it affects the bottom line, until 48 CFR drops, until there is blood in the streets, until there are 1,000 false claims acts, one coming out every week, there will be so many people that will not move on this.
Oh yeah.
100,000+ companies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's see. A couple people in here. He said, going from 110 to 2 isn't rough. That's a catastrophe. Yeah, that's a long day. You got a lot of work to do if you just ignore it. What a horrible way. You're like, oh, I'm glad we got that done. And then you move on. And then, 9-10 months later, you start to fire everything up and the score is just falling off a cliff. That's rough. Will said, SB 800-137 provides great guidance on implementing and managing the information system continuous monitoring program. Yeah, I always find it to be so interesting when you hear people be like, recently, not going to name names, people being like, we got to blow up the RMF. And, in the past, people like the Navy CIO and folks like that being like, oh, yeah, the way that the ATO system works is not good. We need more continuous monitoring. And I'm always like, hey, guys, that's the last step of the RMF. That's part of the system. the RMF and continuous monitoring isn't the problem. It's the context that it's put in, which is sort of exactly what we talked about with organizational deaths, right? You can get rid of all the steps of the RMF and just have one if you want, and you still throw it into the same culture. It's still going to get slowed down to
about to say,
nothing
and
at that point.
here's the icing on this cake. The people that I was talking to were, as the score was dropping, they were consistently assessing their SPUR score on a weekly, monthly basis and showing, hey, this thing's dropping. And until they had to report to the DoD again, there was inaction. And that's the crazy part. Like, had the monitoring piece of it, but the executives and the ones with the purse strings, or the ones that have the ability to enforce behavior, weren't taking action. And so then your compliance officers end up hamstrung, right? Because all they're doing is showing you a bad score, and they don't have the ability to enforce it. Anyways,
Yeah.
fascinating stuff, guys. It is.
Now that you mentioned that, there was
like, CMMC is going to screw the supply chain and screw, the U.S. companies, and small business is going to be put on a ledge and, walking the plank. And I don't disagree with a lot of those statements. However, almost everyone I talked to who should have done this stuff back in 2017, most of them have not even started.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally at this point, we've been doing this for years, man. And it's like, anybody that's been working in the div knows the deal. Everybody knows what's going on. It's open secret. We all know the game here, where the vast majority of companies are not early adopters. They're not adopters at all. The vast majority of companies will sit there and be like, I'll believe it when it's in my contracts.
Yeah.
And we've told people before that you're going to be upside down pretty badly on the timeline if you do that. And they go, okay, we'll see. And, there's reasons for them to believe that. There's arguments, for why they should take that position. Taking risks can sometimes have big payoffs, but a lot of people are taking that risk without all of the context of what's been going
Absolutely.
on.
And before people at me, it's like, I get it. Nobody did it. And if you would have done it, your rates would have been too high to cover the cost, and then you wouldn't be a business anymore.
Terrible situation, man.
I completely get both sides of the conversation. It doesn't stop what you signed up to do, though. Contractually, it does not get you that is not a loophole to get you out of the contract, sadly. So anyways, enough of a soapbox. Let's get to some actual good questions here.
Yeah. Well, speaking of this, in terms of constantly reporting up the changing score to leadership and then them not updating their reporting to DoD, one of the questions that I got sent via DM, they said a consultant told us that we can submit a 110 score to SPRS even with open items, because a POAM makes us compliant as long as it's closed out in 6 months. Is this true? No, it is not true. So off the bat, do not submit a score in which you attribute points to your posture that you do not qualify to get, right? If you have a 5-point control that is unimplemented, you don't get the 5 points. And so if you submit a 110 instead of a 105, you've made a false claim to the government, right? And you're opening yourselves up to a massive risk, right? Now, it is true that you are compliant with DFARS 7012 if you don't have everything implemented and you've got a plan for implementing that. That is true. There is no timeline for when you have to close out those items. This is part of the loophole that DoD is attempting to close. CMMC says that if you have findings resulting from your CMMC assessment and the 1-point controls that are allowed to be on a POAM are open, you have 180 days to close them, so you get 6 months. But there is no such stipulation within DFARS 7012. And that brings up this issue where DFARS 7012 says you have to implement all these controls, but you can have a POAM. DoD says we meant that to be you have to implement everything. You can't just leave them parked on a POAM forever. And everybody goes, well, where does it say that? And we just kind of do this at each other the entire time. And hence this one of the major reasons why we have the CMMC program in the first place. But off the jump, do not submit a score that is artificially inflated.
Don't
do the math on the requirements that you have implemented, add that number up and then submit that number as your score because that's your score. So I don't know who this consultant was, but don't use them.
The DoD assessment methodology, the document and the calculator that's used does not have any carve outs for POAM points. You get negative points if it's on a POAM at that point.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't fully implemented a requirement, it means that one or more of the assessment objectives for that requirement cannot be satisfied, and therefore you don't get the points. Simple as that.
Yep. So
even though you're compliant because you have a plan for implementing all of them, you don't get the points for all of them because otherwise everybody would just have a 110, and that's
right.
not how that works.
Everybody. So
don't do that. Do not do that. That's shame on you, whoever consultant you are out there doing that.
I go back to the conversation I had with, I think it was John Ellis back in the day. He was like, yeah, 80+% of the submissions to Spurs are 110. It's like, maybe they were following that guidance as well.
Yeah, this consultant is out here is a total menace on the on the scoring system. Let's see here. Will said, does an organization have to complete a formal self-assessment to update a previous SPRS score? Can the org simply update the SPRS score as significant remediations occur without a full formal documented assessment? It's not written down anywhere that you have to conduct a full formal assessment. That's not actually a full term. Updating your score, you should just do it, as often as you find reasonable. I would imagine that as soon as you know that a requirement has been corrected and implemented and you get the points, you'd probably just update it. Depends on how often you want to have that rolled up, but that's not stipulated anywhere that you have to conduct a full formal assessment. Although, it's one of those things where it's like, how do you know that you now have the points? You kind of probably have to answer those questions somehow, and you should document how you're answering those questions, which could constitute a full formal assessment, even if it's only at the level of a single requirement. But as significant remediations occur, you should be able to update your score there. Just make sure you have the evidence to back it up. But I don't know if that necessarily means that we have to convene a formal assessment and do things like that.
I think I know where Will's going with this, actually.
Oh, is he trapping us in a corner here?
I don't know if he's trapping us, but the nomenclature of significant change in the scoping guidance. And it says it would require another assessment if a significant change is represented. And so the question is, that would be applicable to self-assessment or certification, ideally. And so
I guess the distinction could be significant change versus what Will says here, significant remediation, right?
Yes.
So I know you're Dan, you gotta bear with Daniel here. He's hyper clued in on the word significant. So any future questions, add the word significant, and you're gonna spin them off into left field.
The amount of questions I've gotten in the past week about significant changes, and then people are like, "Oh, the DoD should tell us," and I'm like, "No. If the DoD tells you, they point you to NIST, and NIST has a definition that you don't want, So don't trap yourselves in the significant change. Just define it internally as an organization as a safe bet.
Yeah. Bruce said, I think the reason for the 110 to 2 drop is failure to prove all of the R-defined assessment objectives in 171A. That's the procedures the company was failing to prove doing. Yeah, so this is why it's important to pay attention to 171A, right? Especially a lot of those keywords in the assessment objectives where they say you've defined something, you've specified something, you've documented something, right? That's the sort of key indicator here. That's like, well, I'm pretty sure that this is implemented, and I know in my head, since I interviewed myself, that everything is good to go. And the next question is where are they defined, right? Where are they specified? Where are they documented? You got hit by a bus. Where's the information? You got a super sweet job doing whatever. Where is the information, right? How would you prove to someone other than yourself that this is true? And so, Bruce, you're absolutely right. You can follow these sort of, keywords in 171A, all the verbs in 171A, and that's a good reason why a lot of people will miss satisfying those objectives and then therefore miss the points. Let's see here. Scott said, I have been suggesting companies provide their own definition of
I think
significant
that's
change.
the way to go, Scott. I'm with you on that.
I think that is a significant innovation in the definition of significant change, because at this point, the DoD ain't giving us clear guidance on what significant change is. You can dig into the books and go with the sort of NIST interpretation of what significant change means in the past through the evolution of 853. But ultimately, it's going to be a judgment call, right? And so I know we've said this multiple times, but I cannot stress this enough to everybody. If we continue to press for the government to define in detail what a significant change is, we're going to get an answer that we don't like. There's never once been a situation where people have been like, you need to tell us exactly what to do, where we got an answer that wasn't a very governmenty answer. So I know the uncertainty is uncomfortable and annoying, but it's probably better than getting constrained into a heavily bureaucratic idea of what significant change is. So, you know, out of the frying pan and into the fire. But I guarantee you, we're going to go through 3.0 rulemaking. People are going to pound the significant change thing. We're going to get an answer and people aren't going to like it. We're going to clip this. We're going to clip this in like 2 years.
FedRAMP references NIST 837. And if you're just curious on what significant change is actually defined by NIST, go read that publication. And then you will quickly keep your mouth shut, asking the DoD any such further clarification.
Yeah, absolutely. Joseph says, "What's up?" His meeting made him late. Thanks for showing up. No worries if you're late. Not a big deal. We're often late to these things sometimes as well. Nicholas says, "What are places doing shredding for CUI? There are many companies that do multi-step shredding, but very few do 1 millimeter by 5 millimeter. And buying an approved shredder is not cheap."
Yeah, so what I think you're probably referencing, and I saw that question come in, is, I'm going to share my screen here. Who doesn't love a pretty picture? In this case, it is from the NARA website about our good friend, destruction of media. and you are correct, right? The 1 by 5 millimeter shredding. The answer is they're trying to either outsource it, but here's a tricky thing about outsourcing. And we've gotten this question a lot. If I outsource my shredding to a third party that can actually do this and certify, are they an external service provider because they are receiving it, controlled and classified information, and they're supporting me in my process, right? They're not an IT person per se, but they are providing a recurring service for my organization that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. And we've never really gotten clarity on that. But
if I put on a polo that says Big Jake's compliant shredding service, and I back my truck up to the front door of your precision machine shop, putting parts on the F-47 17th generation fighter or whatever, and you just load hard copy prints and controlled technical information into the bed of my pickup truck and say, "See you later," that is absurd, right? Like,
well, not only that, according to this, if you give them a shredded but not to code, they basically still consider it not approved and probably still CUI at that point.
Right. So it's like, there's no way that the shredding company can just take non-destroyed, and using the compliant term destroyed, like the 888 prescribed method of 1 by 5 millimeter destroyed CUI. Anything less than that, up to and including just the full documentation in a bag, right? If you hand me that information, like, they would have to have the same level of requirements on their end. You're not allowed to do that with anybody else, right? Like, can I hand the janitor this information? I know nothing about them. Like, they just take, can I throw the information in a wastebasket and they just take it at the end of the night? It's like marked CTI for space lasers or something. Like, I can't do that.
You're right. And Nicholas, I'm sorry, we got on a little bit of a soapbox there. to your point,
yeah, I'm not like mocking what Nicholas is saying.
No,
I'm
no,
sort of
no, no.
mocking the fact that DoD hasn't come
Yes.
out. I feel like this should be a very easy thing for them to draw a line under and be like, don't do that.
Oh, I agree.
You can only give it to a service that's approved. But like Nicholas is saying, those are kind of hard to find.
They're so hard to find. And people are having, to your point, Nicholas, are having to buy shredders. Jacob and I start going down these rabbit trails all day because we get these dang questions all the time. And it's like there's a certain level of confusion around them because, you know, most organizations would be considered an ESP if they had this and had to follow all the same requirements for authorized and a shared responsibility matrix. Now, it's not a huge SRM per se for this level of support, but to your point, Jacob, I agree with you. Like an MSP doesn't get to escape out of this requirement. Why would a shredder that's taking CUI, right? So long story short, Nicholas, people are having to buy the shredder. Bonfire, which is always funny. Finding other ways to dispose of it, but finding a shredder, and this is the hard part, finding a shredder that will give you an SRM and full chain of custody for both of those things, that is really the real potential problem.
Anybody want to fund my startup idea of a mobile 888 shredding service where we just show up, shred it? We never actually take custody of it. Like you just, it's self-service. You just, it's like the food trucks outside of your company. There's like food truck, shred truck, and you just take it out there and shred it in real time.
Let's say you do a shred truck, I'll do an enclave truck, and we'll just kind of show up outside of these organizations and kind of hop in, do the work, print the paper, read it, and then walk next door to yours and shred it.
Yeah, Michael says the compliant destruction is typically done immediately and while being watched by the supplying org. The destruction org then provides a certificate of destruction. Yeah. But, like we said earlier, what if you don't have any of those in your area? What if you can't find one? What if you can't afford it?
A gajillion-dollar printer at that point.
What do you do? What do you do at that point? So, and I know DoD, if you guys are lurking here, as you often do, help us out with an actual answer. Can I just give non-destroyed CUI to a destruction company and they can just drive off with it? Is that okay? Because if I were the Ministry of State Security, I know what my next American subsidiaries are going to be.
Shredding companies all day.
Yeah. Man, what a geez.
That was a fun one, Nicholas. Great question, by the way. You got Jacob and I going, and I love it, man.
I actually wrote this down because I remember talking about this a while ago, and we got to revisit it because I still don't think we have like an official answer from the DoD. So there we go. Joseph said, when we shredded, it was the same. They did it on site and all, but only at the home office. No one in the area would do it. So we bought the pricey shredders. Oh. Sounds like Joseph is going to start a shredding business where you got your CMMC cert, you got the shredder on site, and all your competitors can bring their CUI to you so that you can shred it for them. All righty, let's see. Oh, geez. I've seen people pay compliant companies 3+ hours, drive 3 hours to compliant shredding facilities. The FSOs talk and all meet up at one place to meet the truck. All the FSOs are having a bonfire.
Listen, I love that. Get me in that caravan. I'll jump on board. We'll take a 3-hour drive.
FSOs, yeah. If anybody knows how to party, it's a bunch of FSOs through shredding procedures, and they're all hanging out. But what's that meme? Everybody know that meme that's on TikTok and Instagram where they're like, it's like the guys in the hoods. They're like, doing the thing. It's all the FSO. I'm gonna write this down. Producer Dustin will know what I'm talking about. We're gonna do FSO Bonfire Meme here. Look for it on LinkedIn. Like and subscribe.
Subscribe.
You'll see it later. All right, back to the questions. Do you need to be a defense contractor to be a C3PAO? No, you do not. You do not need to be a defense contractor. You do need to go through the C3PAO vetting process, which is a very well-defined process. If you'd like to know more about the C3PAO vetting process, you can find info on the CyberAB website. You can also find it summarized very well in the recent DoD IG report, where they went through and evaluated how well that process was working. If anybody's got a link in chat, we can send it down there. We did a 4-part podcast episode going through the findings of this process. A lot of people thought that DoD IG report was going to be the nail in the coffin. among many things that were supposed to be the nail in the coffin for CMMC. As it turns out, the process works pretty well. But one of the requirements in this, I think it's like a 12-step process. None of those requirements are that you must be a defense contractor to be a C3PAO. It's pretty involved, but it is pretty clear and pretty robust, and it works pretty well, apparently. So you can definitely check that out if you want to know more information. Let's see here. Are you aware of CMMC standards applying to federal agencies outside of DoD, such as the State Department? According to rumor, yes. The likely candidates are off the bat GSA and NASA for sure. We've heard State Department, National Nuclear Safety Administration, and we've heard
Department of Transportation.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So just for 171, not CMMC, but we've heard 800-171 making its rounds well ahead of the FAR CUI requirement in some of these agencies.
Sorry, just to go back to the shredding thing. I guess the drive was from Atlanta to Huntsville for the FSO Bonfire. Somebody get Scott Edwards on the phone. Scott, put a compliant shredder in the back of headquarters, because have we got an additional business offering for you to consider?
Talk about a managed service, my friend.
There you go. As long as we call it Big Jake's shredding, let's brainstorm a topic.
Yeah, I like that. We'll workshop a little bit.
Something fun. I want like the Fallout guy with the thumbs up being like, we'll shred it for you. Okay, let's see here. Do you think the changes occurring at CISA will affect the rollout of CMMC? No, I do not. Yeah. There's been a long-running, deep-seated rivalry, blood feud between CISA and DoD because humans are going to human regardless of where they work and what type of work they're doing. No, there won't be any effect to the rollout of CMMC in the DoD space because of the absolute bloodbath that is occurring over at CISA, which in my opinion is pretty unfortunate. So I think that it's, probably a reinforcing mechanism for DoD and the CMMC approach for other agencies by the fact that CISA is being hollowed out at the leadership levels, at their offering levels, all the stuff they're doing just sort of doesn't necessarily elevate DoD, but it kind of leaves them as one of the only games in town. As far as like a high level, national level center of what's going on with cybersecurity, just trying to do stuff about cybersecurity, DoD is one of the few places that's relatively unscathed by various changes in the political winds, if you will. Dude,
I don't think look at what John posted here. Definitely Department of Transportation and Department of Homeland Security in a league with that is the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, requiring CMMC controls for sensitive security information SSI, which is a category of CUI. Fascinating, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where like we talked about before, you have the CMMC policy, like the high level policy from DoD, very difficult to predict the various ways that it will manifest and pop up and sort of percolate through different supply chains, different programs, other agencies, all that stuff. There's nothing preventing from other agencies from leveraging a CMMC certification requirement for what they want to do, especially when it involves CUI and 800-171. That's a great point that John made, but there's probably a bunch of them that we can't even anticipate at this point that are likely to happen. So always something to remember. Alrighty. Do I need CMMC to bid on contracts? No, you do not. Nope. You do not need a CMMC status to bid on a contract. The solicitation that will come out that you bid on will specify that in order to take award of a contract, you need to have a given CMMC status: CMMC level 1, CMMC level 2 self-assessment, CMMC level 3 C3PAO assessment, CMMC level 3. The phased rollout that DoD will use once the 48 CFR CMMC rule goes final kind of sort of dictates that at the beginning you're going to have no CMMC level 3 status requirements in solicitations. There's this big question mark around how many of the solicitations will be level 2 self-assessment, level 2 C3 PAO assessments. We think that more of them than not will have C3 PAO requirements than self-assessment, but your mileage may vary exactly for the reason we talked about earlier. It's very tough to predict what will be going on, but you don't need it to bid. That being said, we did a podcast on PALT times, procurement administrative lead times, and the GAO put out a report that said the median wide PALT time for the DoD is very short. It's like 30 or 40 days. We just talked to a prime contractor earlier this week, and they said that their window is 30 days.
Yep.
And so that's a big problem, especially if you're dealing with task orders and things like that. These are not like big, huge, single award, massive contracts or anything like that. The vast majority of stuff is just contract orders. And that stuff can turn around really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So you don't need it to bid on a contract, but the key question there is how much of a window do you have from when your customer solicitation goes out until your customer awards that work? And that is really the key metric, because if that window is shorter than the amount of time that you need to implement and get certified to take award, then you necessarily have to start before the solicitation comes out that you would be bidding on. So you don't need it to bid, but most people need to start well before they plan on bidding, just because of the way that the timelines work out. Okay. Will the DoD memo limiting IT consulting and management contracts impact CMMC? No, it will not. So I saw some people talking about this on LinkedIn, as we so often do. Let's see here. Let me pull this up. So the news was that SecDef Pete Hegseth penned a memo that said that we aren't going to do these big IT management and consulting contracts any longer. These are like the Accentures and the Booz Allens of the world and things like that.
I saw Booz Allen cut 7% of their workforce, I think.
Reston is getting worked over this kind of news. And so, agree, disagree, whatever. But as far as what the memo says, the thing that people were keying in on, as far as I could tell on LinkedIn, was they said, well, if the department can do this kind of work, we're going to do that rather than outsourcing it to these big, massive contracts. And somebody said, well, DIBCAC exists, therefore we're not going to use C3 PAOs to do this assessment. Couple problems, right? One, these are IT management and consulting contracts, not standard DoD acquisitions, right? They're not doing parts that go onto weapon systems, right? The vast majority of DoD contractors are not involved in this kind of work. Second of all, regardless, it's been well established that DIBCAC is a internal function of the DoD under the Defense Contract Management Agency that cannot scale to meet the level of assessment that DoD would like to achieve in order to have assurance that contractors are implementing their requirements to protect the DoD's data. And so they're still going to have to use outsourced work through C3 PAOs in order to scale that assessment. But this memo does not have anything to do with the CMMC space or the vast majority of the work that companies affected by CMMC would do. And even if it did, they aren't able to do it inside of the agency. So I've seen this pop up a couple times, but just zoom out and look at the news since January. The idea that we would suddenly plus up a couple thousand full-time government employees in the current environment and sentiment around government employees is a non-starter. So I don't care what memos get written. That's not going to be a thing that happens. We couldn't do that even before that sentiment became the reigning sentiment of the day. You just can't hire enough people to work at DIBCAC in order to scale it, which is why they opted for this external sort of C3 PAO setup in the ecosystem. Alrighty, let's see here. Everybody's chatting back and forth. Everybody's having a good time. Oh boy. John said, John, you're full of good news today. John said, California, New York, and Texas are requiring GovRamp on state projects.
So we got state ramp, we got gov ramp, we got fed ramp.
We got
you
ramp,
get a ramp. I get a ramp.
Everybody look under your seats. We got a ramp for you. I am very surprised that there is no Cal ramp. given the what I know about my home state, the great state of California. We love stuff like that, apparently. I'm very surprised that, especially California and New York's rivalry around, like, who could come up with more ideas, is the way I'll say it. Very surprised that there's no, New York ramp, Cal ramp. I haven't looked into this though, John. So thanks for giving me something to dig into over the weekend. Let's see here.
It's a fun question by Jason. I remember talking to Bonner about this back a while ago. It's like, yeah, there's an executive order saying NIST is the safeguarding mechanism for CUI. However, there was this little missing ingredient where it was implemented into contracts, contractual vehicles, kind of downstream. And so that's what FAR CUI was looking to ramp up. I think the intent was a lot quicker than it's been. How many years is it making now, Jacob?
Almost 10. Almost 10
years. Yeah. So, yeah, you're not wrong, Jason. It absolutely was. The trick is getting into contractual requirements of the contractors. That's been the big linchpin there. So,
yeah, that was the last piece of the big plan for implementing. So you had the executive order, and then you had the CUI program get implemented via rule by NARA in 2016, and then the implementing part of that rule in contracts was supposed to be the FAR CUI rule. And so we had the executive order, we implemented it for the federal agencies with the CUI programs at the agencies per the federal CUI program. But like you're saying, Jason, as soon as that data is outside of a federal information system, you have to implement 171. And if you don't have the contract language that says that, what are you going to do? And so we just went around and around for years and years. We did some podcasts earlier last year where we documented the former ISU director, which is the part of NARA that was in charge of all this. We documented his slow slide into insanity while he was waiting for, literally pleading with the government to issue this rule. So yeah, that is absolutely a good point.
And you're right, Jason. Some some agencies have been slipping NIST into contracts, like Department of Transportation that we just talked about, and DHS and things like that. However, there's not a formal top level, which is what FAR CUI would be. Yeah,
absolutely. Supposed to normalize it. The CUI program was harmonization before harmonization was cool, right? Is the way to think about it. Before everybody got into this like regulatory harmonization, that's exactly what the CUI program is supposed to be. Nobody likes to talk about it though, because it doesn't feel cool whenever it actually happens. They just like talking about the idea, but that's what it would look like when you actually harmonize all these different authorities and you come up with one set of requirements for one thing. That's exactly what people are asking for. So there you go.
I didn't know, John, State Ramp got renamed to GovRamp. So I guess State Ramp is no more. Jacob, make a note.
Here we go. Yeah, we gotta dive into that one. So
here.
Got to dive into that one. I personally liked it when we had a different name for all of them. We just keep coming up with something new. What's the problem? All righty, let's see here. All right, nice simple question for you, Daniel. How much does CMMC cost?
Somewhere between 40 to 80K is kind of what we're seeing. Somewhere in that ballpark. A ton of variables, number of sites, complexity of environment, employee count, boundary size, all that kind of fun stuff. But on average, we're sitting somewhere in the 40 to 80K range.
Now, this is for assessment. This is not for everything that comes before assessment. Right?
Oh, that's your question. Oh,
I don't know, because a lot of times what happens, people say, how much does CMMC cost? And people will
always say it's
your assessment process, is pretty well defined at this point. It's, sometimes you hear 30, sometimes you hear 80, somewhere in that ballpark. Seems to be kind of what's going on over time. That'll probably be the lower end of that range. But to get through the assessment, you have to have everything implemented. And that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Well, yeah. So I had a podcast I recorded with Align C3PAOs. And I basically was asking them, like, what's the holdup? Like, there's 250 or so, I think, certified organizations now, or somewhere around that. I think was the last count that I saw. That includes joint surveillance conversions. And I was like, what's the holdup? They're like, we've got people lined out the door that signed up for assessments last year. The problem is we can't get anybody through phase one, meaning they can't provide the documentation to the assessor for the assessment to actually occur. Seems a little problematic, right? So what's funny is
exactly the reason why the assessments exist in the first place.
Yeah, the narrative of there's not enough C3POs has kind of evaporated, because I know C3POs with capacity to start in like 2 to 4 weeks from notification, because they've had to suspend so many assessments because people can't get their stuff together to send it over. So that the preparation work, Scott Edwards kind of coined this, right? It's like it's a 6-figure problem, and it really is a 6-figure problem. I mean, I don't know. I personally have not met any organizations who have done this for less than $100,000 and gone through a certification. There might be some out there. I'd love to read a case study on them. Their boundary must be like a laptop, and like that's it. And the question is all the CUI actually able to sit on that system? That's another fun conversation. But yeah. Anyways, so it's a 6-figure problem. $100,000 to $300,000 depending on hiring of FTEs internally or outsourcing, licensing cost. Some people having to move some of their critical line of business applications, right? We see this a lot in the machining world, manufacturing space. It is not cheap and takes a long time. I met with a company, about 1,700 users, that's divesting from what was their parent into their own environment, and they have a 12-month runway, and even that's going to be cutting it fairly close to some extent, having to lift and shift core business applications, the Microsoft Gov element of it, redeveloping all the documentation, you name it. So
let's see here.
Oh, we got a Seek question. You were at Seek West.
I was at Seek West. Seek West was in Las Vegas. And so I'd probably be more appropriate to say I was in Vegas. So yeah, lots of information put out at Seek West. Work conferences in Vegas, and I have a checkered past, is what I'll say. But I left up $1,900. So,
Hey, there you go.
Hey, so yeah, if you would like strategies for CMMC and questions, or strategies for winning money at the craps table, this is the stream for you. Anyways, the question at Seek West, Stacy talked about international contractors meeting CMMC, and it seemed that foreign countries can have some autonomy. My question is related to data residency and cloud service provider FedRAMP authorization. FedRAMP requires CONUS data residency, and CMMC requires FedRAMP authorization. Will the international contractor be required to use cloud service providers that are FedRAMP authorized? And if so, what of the data residency requirements? What a delightful question, Daniel. You love this question.
Oh, yeah. So at CS2 this year, I answered this question about 4 times. UK, Sweden, a bunch of different people were there. And the Q&A that Stacy was referencing is this one right here from the CMMC CIO website. Do foreign countries need to develop their own assessment and training organizations and obtain CMMC program acceptance agreements with the US? No. Just do what 32 CFR says, is basically what this text down here says. There's 2 things to think about. One, as we know very clearly, and it's been said publicly at this point, there is not reciprocity with our friendly foreign countries, right? Meaning, and with this FAQ, it's saying, listen, you don't need to develop a program. And by the way, we're not going to give you reciprocity even if you do. So just follow what's in 32 CFR. What's in 32 CFR is if you're using a CSP, it has to be FedRAMPed. The problem is FedRAMP doesn't exist internationally, right? You would have to end up then looking to get the data centers you're using consent to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent and having a 3PAO come out and assess them and be able to produce the right evidence. Well, the problem is most of you are using large cloud providers like Microsoft Commercial and multi-geo mode, right? Or you name it. And Microsoft Commercial doesn't have a FedRAMP authorization anymore. So when you start peeling back the onion, if an international company is going to use a cloud provider and it's going to process, store, and transmit CUI, it has to be FedRAMP or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. That's it. There is no extra permission given. You could reach out to the DoD CIO, if you wanted to be able to state an exemption. But the things that, and Matt Travis actually said this from the stage, the things that a C3PO looks at is the implementation of the NIST 171 control framework against the assets that you've defined and the boundary you've defined, and FedRAMP moderate. They do not assess against incident response requirements of those cloud providers, which is interesting. So a C3PO is not responsible for assessing C through G of DFARS 7012. This is my biggest rub with the whole thing. I'm going on a little bit of a side tangent here. You can be CMMC L2 certified and not in compliance with DFARS 7012 now.
Yes.
Which, in my opinion, was kind of the main reason, right? So anyways, I've got feelings on that. I've got feelings on that all day long. But long story short, if you're going to use a cloud provider and you're not in the US, FedRAMP moderate equivalent or FedRAMP moderate or no cloud provider, or reach out to the DoD CIO to see if you can get an approved exemption.
Yeah, and I mean, and conceptually that makes sense, right? Because, you know, the whole reason behind FedRAMP, you know, from the DoD is they're saying when we put our data in the cloud, it has to be FedRAMP. When you put our data in the cloud, it has to be FedRAMP. And so the idea here is if you international company puts our data in the cloud, doesn't need FedRAMP, wouldn't be consistent with the interpretation. But boy, is it a mess.
Yeah. Man, that was a really, I don't know who asked that question. Do we have a name on that person?
Let's see.
I don't know who asked that question, but it's a very, very good question. So
absolute bangers today with all the questions. So good job, everybody. Let's see. Edward says, it seems like a seam. It seems like a seam.
Is it a sim or a seam? Let's go ahead and just clarify that out of the gate.
Everybody get this, get all the giggles out now. It
That's
seems
right.
like a seam is almost required for compliance with the audit and compliance controls. Is there any solution besides a seam that would fulfill those requirements? Well, off the top, it's going to make your life a lot easier. So from what I remember, I haven't looked at this question in a while. You could theoretically meet the requirements without a seam, but it's a lot of work. And so it's one of those questions of like, should you? You'd have to have a very good reason to just not use something like a seam in order to satisfy a lot of those requirements. I think that the way that the requirements are written is a bit arbitrary because when you piece them all together, you're like, oh, it's a seam, right? But what do you think here, Daniel?
I mean, you could technically go to different log sources, and especially if you're a very, very small environment that might not be a ton of overhead to do a non-seam related thing. However, in CMMC 1.0, little throwback here, for those unaware, this is not applicable today, but there was clearer language saying centralized logging, which would definitely more indicate a seam type solution, right? That was stripped away when CMMC 2.0 came back and did full alignment with NIST 171. But yeah, you technically do not need one. However, for the sake of sanity, and especially if you're a small team, it makes things a lot easier to have that single pane of glass for the ingestion and monitoring of all of your logs. So you know that you can go and respond there. So yeah, it's not a requirement. It makes, to Jacob's point, makes life a lot easier. And I haven't looked at 171 Rev 3 to see if they incorporate any kind of centralized language back into that. But yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Hey, Dano Dog is back. Long time no see. Can we talk passwords, specifically password managers and MFA authenticators if they are CLOI? I don't know if this got cut off or if it was a typo. So maybe Dano, you can
maybe that's CUI if they are CUI.
If they are CUI, if they are okay.
Oh, here we go.
There we go. Do password managers, if cloud-based, need to be FedRAMP? Reading 800-171 makes the control sound like they are talking systems doing one-way hash. Do my cloud-based password managers need to be FedRAMP? Daniel, do you have a slide on this? I want to say.
It's funny. I think I do. Hold for a second, please.
Well,
the short answer is no. They don't have to be unless they're CUI. Now,
right.
There only be CUI if it's information relating to a federal agency directly, right? So be aware of that. But if it's just your credentials to log into your email service, right, inside of your company that has CUI in it, right, like your CUI, then no, it does not have to be FedRAMP.
Let's see here. Somewhat related here. I heard that SMS for two-factor authentication will be deprecated as an acceptable method soon. is there a two-factor authentication alternative for non-smartphone 2FA authorization app users?
Yes, YubiKeys, passwordless type deployments, right? So RSA type tokens, which are a rolling numeric sequence, or most people are going to like a YubiKey type solution, which is a physical hardware token that you can plug into your device, and that's your second factor, is a physical thing, versus a soft app that you would get a push notification or even a text or call.
Yeah. Now, I think from a general security perspective, SMS-based two-factor authentication has been deprecated for a long time. I am not aware. Maybe somebody has a link. I am not aware of anywhere that says under CMMC DFARS guidance that SMS-based two-factor authentication will not be an accepted method sometime soon.
I've not heard that either. I've heard technology's deprecating it, but I've not heard it as a compliance requirement.
Now,
so this is.
We'll definitely recommend the YubiKeys, as a solution, just in general. But playing the game here, I do not know of a strict policy indicator that has said that will not be accepted sometime, quote unquote, soon.
So this is in the CMMC L2 scoping guidance document. Security protection data means data stored or processed by security protection assets. Does not have to be FedRAMP, by the way. And passwords that grant access to the in-scope environment would call under security protection data. So there's your, legalese classification that you do not have to do FedRAMP for passwords.
Very nice. All righty, let's see here. Does my MSP MSSP need to only employ U.S. citizens?
Maybe. So what's fun about this is that there's, just to make things even more complicated, right? There's what they refer to as basic CUI, which is CUI, which just NIST 171. Then there's specified CUI, which is things added above that requirement. So like DFARS 7012 is technically dealing with specified CUI because you have FedRAMP thrown in there, you have incident response thrown in there, things like that. But another thing that would make something specified CUI is if you have markings of dissemination that require things like U.S. personship, right? No foreign markings. Or if you're working with the Department of State, if you're working with the Department of Commerce, and certain levels of export control have U.S. person requirements, that's the majority of them. And then the rest, a very small percentage might have U.S. citizens. So NNPI is a good example of that, naval nuclear propulsion information, right? It's thrown into another tier of not only personship, but also citizenship when you start looking at everything. And so long story short, if you're dealing with controlled technical information, you're likely in the export control business at that point because of the way that CTI is represented by the authorities. If you look at the DoD CUI registry. So meaning that your MSP would at least need to be U.S. persons if they have the ability to access the information. Not even that they have, but the specific language is calls or enables someone to be able to gain access. So not only does your MSP MSSP might have to be a U.S. person, but if they use outsourced services with, again, the ability to access that information, their services that they're using, right? So if they're using a 24/7 SOC service because they're an MSP of 10 people and can't do 24/7 monitoring and response, guess what? That requirement also falls to them because they would have access to that environment that would cause or enable them to gain access to the information. Now, because I like to leave people with a little goodie bag to take home with them, I have a pretty PowerPoint slide on just this statement. So if you have a question, this is something that you can share internally, and this is for ITAR specifically. And the red box down here, which is a little hard to read, but says the use of access information like credentials to cause or enable a foreign person, including yourself, to access, view, or possess unencrypted technical data. So this is the kind of the gotcha here. So CTI being controlled technical information, you're going to be a U.S. persons requirement. NNPI information, naval nuclear propulsion, it's going to catapult you into U.S. citizen level. And there's other export control, I believe, that also has that classification. So that was a very long way to say maybe. But the answer is it depends on the type of data and the other requirements you have surrounding that.
Let's see. Michael has a reading recommendation for the weekend. OpNav instruction N9210.3. So we got GovRamp to read. We got OpNav instructions to read this weekend. Lots of fun stuff to do this weekend. Let's see. We have 15 seconds. Rapid fire.
All right.
Do I need an SSP for CMMC level 1? No, you do not. And I can show you in the final rule that came out in October. It is recommended that an organization seeking assessment develop a SSP as a best practice at level 1. However, it is not required for a level 1 assessment. Now, it's going to be pretty hard to document stuff. It's going to be pretty hard. SSP is probably the way that you want to do that, especially if you have plans to go to level 2. But technically, you do not need one at level 1.
Do you have another rapid fire for us? Or is that it? I love, by the way, Dark Green. This should be a weekly 2-hour show. 1 hour is simply not enough.
I mean, we've said this multiple times. I mean, the queue is getting longer and longer. I didn't even have a chance to check the form submissions for this week, plus a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, maybe we got to go to 2 hours. Maybe we got to go to 2 a week. Maybe we got to figure out what's going on. So, you know, what do you guys think? Let us know in chat. But that's an hour. We're already at an hour. Awesome questions this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. You can find this recording on LinkedIn. You can find it on YouTube. If you find this afterwards, you can feel free to submit questions in the comments over there. You can send it to us via our DMs on LinkedIn. You go to CUIHotline.org and fill out the form. You can call the number and you can leave a message, and then we'll queue it up and get to it as soon as we can. Thanks everybody for tuning in every Friday, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good one, guys.